هيبدأ من عند السياسة. I'm welcoming you, Congressman Fortenberry.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here with you. أنا مبسوط هنا.
Okay. We're very happy to have you here. So this is not your first visit to Egypt, as I was just explaining to our audience. It dates back to the late 1970s when you were first here. How often did you come afterwards? I heard you were here in 2007?
Yes, this is my fourth visit to Egypt.
Okay.
I've been here 3 times since being in Congress. It's been a while since my last visit, but I can tell you the early one, when I was a much younger man, was quite extraordinary. A real gift to me from the Egyptian people. I lived with 10 families throughout the region, from the wealthiest, most accomplished, to the poorest, with farmers, had shropshey in the Bedouin tent, planted trees in the Sinai as a part of an international work project. Just an extraordinarily inviting environment at that time, particularly because it was during the year the peace accords were signed, and America's and Egypt's relationship was so strong and proximate and good. It was a real formative time. In fact, I've made the comment, since this was my first international experience, I consider Egypt to be, in a certain sense, like my mother. You helped raise me.
Okay, so I remember also that particular timing and how Egyptians embraced the American thoughts and ideas, and how the U.S. aid at first started back at the time, and we had what we used to call, the aid things. I remember we used to have autobuset Carter, that is Carter buses, because these were American aid buses. We even had Carter's thighs, and these were chickens. Thighs. But they were called Carter's thighs at the time.
This is interesting because I had not heard that, but people would stop and kiss me on the street and tell me I look just like Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
It's a way of conferring a compliment.
All right, and then you came back afterwards, after you became a congressman.
Yes.
I think, when was that, 2007?
I was in Sharm el-Sheikh for a World Economic Forum. I believe that was in 2008, and in proximate to that was here on another trip in which we had come through the Middle East, met with the parliament and a number of legislators at that time, President Mubarak, to talk about some of the dynamics in the country.
Right, and then you came again, I think, in 2011.
I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the exact years.
Around the time,
Yes,
after the 25th of January revolution, you
No, I have not been here since.
You have not been here?
I have not been here, so this is my first trip since, yes.
After it all started.
Correct.
So how do you see it? I mean, along those years, like you're talking about 35 years,
right,
and you've seen Egypt, you've just called it or a mother, back in the late 1970s. How do you see it now with all the turbulences within Egypt and in the region?
Well, the traffic is much worse, I can tell you that, but this is an indication, though, of ongoing development and movement toward more prosperity for more people. I lived near here in Tahrir Square for a portion of my time, and used to grab the bus myself and crowd in, sometimes holding on with one hand and one foot in the door just to get a ride. So I had the experience at street level. I'm very gratified and fortunate to be a member of the United States Congress, and of course that gives me the privilege and the responsibility to help lead and to interact with your leadership. But my first early experiences were on the street with the people. The society has very much progressed in terms of the modern development of economic goods. That is very, very clear. It has expanded greatly as the population has expanded. The number of high-rises and hotel developments, as well as housing, has greatly expanded. I asked a question one day when I was here in the first visit. I said, why are the buildings not complete on the top? And it has to do with taxes and other phenomena, as I understand it. So I've seen an enormous amount of change in about the last 40 years of the development of society. And then, of course, you mix in that with what has happened politically and the dynamics of how to shape Egyptian society from a security perspective, promote economic development and prosperity, while moving toward robust human rights and those considerations that are consistent with democratic ideals and values. All of these things are now part of the ongoing mix of Egyptian society. So all of this that was very different than the conversation almost 40 years ago, which was more about the geopolitical strategic relationship for which Egypt very much sacrificed, losing President Sadat, being very courageous in signing a peace accord with Israel, allowing and inviting and leveraging appropriately so our leadership to help broker that deal, all of which have enormous strategic implications that are still with us today. It's one of the things that I've reminded my colleagues of, particularly in the last 5 years, that the stability of Egypt is absolutely essential to international security. That even though at times it's been a cold peace, nonetheless there is a roadmap for peace in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And it happened because of the sacrificial leadership of 3 countries in 1979. So that was the early context for my visit, and that continues to be the foundation of my own disposition toward the potential for the United States and Egyptian relationship.
Perfect. Now, with all the changes that have happened, and we are living in a completely different world right now. The whole world is different, the whole region is different, the whole Egypt is different, the whole US is different. We're not the same. We're not the same peoples, we're not the same. The only thing that remains, maybe, and not for all of us, is the geography. Not for all countries, of course. How do you see this progressing in the coming period? I know you've met with MPs yesterday over dinner, and you had a very positive note in speaking to them about looking at the future. However, we need to look at the present as well in order to be able to achieve what we want in the future. How do you see that?
Well, if you categorize Egypt's challenge, and really it's the challenge of any society at large, it's security, economic, and then what I call a values proposition. Mm-hmm. Regarding security, that is an internal question as well as an external question. The neighborhood in which Egypt sits is in a deep turmoil, as we all know. Mm-hmm. I think Egypt must play a substantive role and be repositioned to rightfully gain its leadership role that it has traditionally held in the Arab world, not only as a cultural and population center, but as a leader in terms of geopolitical outcomes. I want to see that happen. I think this is very important. However, for that to happen, the internal reforms, the internal self-analysis, as your president has rightly called for, I believe, in the last few months, has to take place. And that means a recommitment to a healthy form of nationalism, the proper participation in the government and reform process, and accepting of the ideas that some types of economic reform are going to have to take place in order for there to be potential economic prosperity in the future. And all of this lends itself, again, to that third point, the deeper values question. What is a society truly made of in order to answer where are we going, which was your initial question. It's this idea of human dignity, that each person matters, each person belongs, and we should set up our governance structures to ensure that there is justice for all, that there are the protection of rights, that the concept of pluralism, which is very unique in Egypt, particularly in regards to the rest of the Middle East, and isn't under the same type of distress as it is in the Middle East, is not only preserved, but celebrated. I would point out something. Don't think it went unnoticed when President Sisi went on television with the Grand Imam and Pope Tewodros and said, "We are all Egyptians." Very important statement.
That was on the 3rd of July, 2013. And that's the date where the U.S. administration, I'd say, remained very hesitant and indecisive, and it took them quite a while. I always use the statement of, at the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but we will remember the silence of our friends. Do you think that 18 months, perhaps it was, of total, utter silence and almost a boycott from the U.S. administration to Egypt has affected the Egyptian-American relations in terms of those people out on the street that used to kiss you on the cheeks? If you go down the street right now as an American, do you think they will still kiss you on the cheeks?
Well, there's two issues there. I just came from your market in Kane o Kalili. I wanted to see it again, and people were very friendly. Of course, these are merchants who depend upon being, their livelihood being very friendly. But it seemed to me to be authentic and genuine. However, I would also be hesitant to walk out on the street because of security considerations. The deeper issue here is there's two issues to your question. One is the general response from the United States during that particular period, difficult period of uncertainty, and there being a hitting of the pause button on the relationship because of the military's intervention to try to prevent further disorder or chaos or even potential collapse, and how that appeared in terms of a grab for power or whether it was the necessity for stabilization. So in the broad sense of the circumstance, the pause on the development of the relationship is understandable. Now, I will tell you, because of my own experience in Egypt, that I had personally advocated for a continuation, particularly of the military-to-military relationship shortly thereafter, because I saw this more through the lens of needing to stop the chaos and disorder, because even though the Middle East has many, many sore spots at the moment, particularly Syria and Iraq and even Turkey and of course other places, can you imagine the collapse of Egyptian society? Its population?
Well, it looked at the time like the administration did not really mind. I remember because I used to talk on television about the Apaches and the
right, but I'm talking to you about my own personal view.
Your personal view.
And how I, again, in my role, was advocating.
Yeah.
Was advocating. So I'm trying to explain why, in a general American policy sense, even though I didn't develop it myself, the uncertainty caused the pause, and then what I personally did because of knowing the situation a little bit more proximately, having had experience here. So it looks to me like we're moving past that. There are concerns that, there are still concerns in this regard, and they've been expressed to me very vociferously by your leadership, and that's understandable. I think, though, that the development of the military-to-military relationship, or the ongoing development of it, has to be rooted in mutual understanding and trust, fellowship, if you will. Then we develop the necessary transactions, and all of this happens at once and simultaneously. And because if you're only negotiating this or that piece of equipment, you're not refreshing that initial values proposition, which is so important to the tie, and then we're not potentially strengthening it. So that's what I want to see.
That's the military to military, and it's quite important. And I believe this was not as negatively affected as the rest of the relations.
Yes.
And this is why I started my question with how the layman feels. I know that Egypt is part of a small region, not in the maximum interests of the US. Asia Pacific is probably more interesting now to the US administration, looking at countries surrounding Russia and Europe and the changes happening there. So Egypt is not that much of a priority. But it could be very easily that you win again the sentiments of Egyptians, or it could have been not so difficult to lose the sentiments of the Egyptian people. How do you think the future can, I mean, you having elections coming up, you're either having a Republican administration or another Democrat administration. And we stand in one of those rare moments where we don't really know who would side with us as Egyptians or us as Arabs. And I'm not talking now as government, I'm talking as people. How do you see it?
I don't think we should take the relationship that we have with Egypt for granted. I don't think Egyptians should take the relationship they have with America for granted. In other words, there is a solid foundation here that was built after World War, based upon sacrifice, that has held. It's had its tough spots, it's had its cold moments, but it has held. The responsibility is both ways in terms of fellowship, friendship, mutual trust. So the new model moving forward I would like to see is, again, an elevation of Egypt's essential role in the Middle East, not only in terms of your effort to secure things internally here and develop sound governance structures and develop out civil society for the protection of rights, but also that leadership role that you have traditionally played in the region. President Sisi has offered a peace plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's hardly translated. It's not seen. The other comments that have been made...
It was not supported as well. Nobody has taken it seriously in order to support it and put it into action.
So there's two issues. Does Egypt now have a stature because of all of the internal turmoil? Because it has not branded itself any longer? Because the necessary hard reforms about recreating a robust society are in process or haven't yet been fulfilled? And so the demand that there be that level of respect without working toward it creates a certain distance, if you will, or Egypt is not, as you've suggested, not as big of a priority. I think it should be a priority. I think the relationship is sound on many levels. I think it should be revived, replenished, and refreshed. And Egypt should be empowered, first, again, by your own internal resolve to the reforms of society to reposition itself as a leadership position. Again, back to the point, can you imagine, again, taking Egypt for granted, can you imagine an Egypt that becomes highly unstable or even volatile? This would be horribly problematic for international stability, our own national security as well as other people.
So how come, I mean, I could see your own personal initiative and the initiative of some of the other honorable congressmen and senators who've been to Egypt and visited Egypt and tried to strengthen economic ties with Egypt, because right now we know that the major issue we're facing is economic and then security, not the other way around. So how come the administration is not looking at ways in terms of discussing with Egyptians means of trying to overcome the present hurdles in terms of the economic difficulty to get out of it?
Yeah. Well, it's my understanding that you're in very intense negotiation with the IMF about structural economic reforms.
But IMF is not U.S. administration, or it's become part of it, or what?
No, it's not U.S. administration, but nonetheless, we all depend upon these types of transparency in terms of economic structure in order for there to be the right type of reforms. In our own economic aid package, there is a request that we allow that money potentially to be leveraged as part of the package of IMF reform. So there's an interrelationship there.
Congressman, I'm not looking for a political answer. I'm actually looking at, I'm telling you how people feel out on the street. It's a matter of, they know that we have a financial crisis. They know we have an economic problem. And they would look at who will be there in order to support. We're not talking about somebody just pumping in money. We're talking about somebody, for example, opening markets for Egyptian exports, or helping some of these ideas that used to happen back in the 1980s and 90s pretty well before things got cold during the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration. Where is the United States?
Okay, but I won't give you a political answer. Okay. Is Egypt willing to embrace the internal reforms that will create the conditions for long-term prosperity and therefore make the investment very inviting, not only by the United States, by private market entities, as well as other foreign partners? I think that's the dance, the delicate dance here. I think it is. You are looking, don't look to us to save you. You're not. I know you're not saying that.
We're not looking at you to save us.
But you're saying do something. You must do something. And I think the finger comes back the other way and saying, is the will to reform there? Now, I'm not here to lecture you or anybody else who's watching this program. All I'm doing is, as an observer of the current conditions, and participating in a process in which we together try to find these hard answers. That means, like in any family, you have to say sometimes hard things to one another.
Certainly, that's very well understood. But it's an issue of all these advices, like the ones we've heard from Mrs. Clinton back in 2011 and 2012 when she was Secretary of State.
Yeah.
And then you look at her and you say, come on, practice what you preach. Today, we see that her longtime aide has become the editor-in-chief of an Islamist magazine, and then you say, how come you've been preaching us and you have been breaching there, so you can't preach and breach at the same time? Of course, the reforms that are needed, like human rights and democracy and so on, isn't it a long process?
And economic reforms.
And economic reforms, of course. But I mean, these are the ones, I mean, democracy and human rights are the ones that have been the focus of the U.S. advice to Egypt. And now the economic reforms, and definitely you can see the strides that Egypt is trying to take, because there's no alternative to it. It's not a matter of we're telling you help, but we're just thinking in terms of, in 10 years' time, when this is all over, we will definitely look at who's been there and who was absent, don't you think?
Why am I having this conversation with you?
I don't know, because you're here, not absent.
Because I'm here.
Will you run for U.S. president?
You have to call my wife.
Okay.
It's a fair set of questions, but the premise of your question is there's two premises working in your question. The first of all, the challenges that you are throwing at me are indications of a desire for a deeper relationship. And I think that is good. The second premise, though...
Actually, I'm not throwing anything at you. I'm just following your model that you gave of let's look at tomorrow, not today. So I'm just trying to look at tomorrow.
The second premise is you must do something. I think the new architecture in the 21st century of international relations with Egypt, the United States, and all countries is, again, a values proposition that suggests what type of governance structure and societal order are going to come about, that is based upon human dignity, so that people can feel safe, protected, have lives that they can use their own gifts of their own two hands and their intellect to make things prosper, and to live in harmony with their neighbor. That's the reality of the architecture where we need to go in international affairs. Not transactional relationships. The transactional relationship should flow forth from, again, shared value and shared trust. Both can work together, and I think that's the dance here. The other thing you presume is that administrations or certain people in administration do certain things. I can't control that. I can control what I can control. I don't speak fully for America here. Certain American policies are not reflective of my own view. My own view, though, is what I've laid out to you. I think the relationship has a solid foundation. It has drifted, particularly of late. It ought to be revived. We are in intense negotiations with military-to-military exchange, which is a part of the foundation of that relationship. I would love to see, again, if I walked out of here on the street, people kissing me on the cheek. That is a longer process, though, of building trust, but it also is a dialogue that must come from Egypt itself, that reaches out to the world and says, here's who we are, here's our brand.
Okay, and when I give your wife a call in order to ask for you running for president, I'll ask her if I can kiss you on the cheek.